I'd like to welcome to the show Walter Olson, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Free the Economy, Walter.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So background for our listeners and YouTube viewers. Walter has a new study out on election procedure and security, and I think a lot of people are going to be interested in that. So the title of that study is Efficient, Timely, and Reliable, a Framework for Election Law. And the study itself focuses on Nevada, and so it talks about some of the particular concerns for Nevada moving up in the list of primary states, for example. But I think the issues and recommendations here are applicable to lots of other states, really all the other states. So before we get into some of those detailed recommendations, obviously there's been a lot of controversy and accusations about fraud and election irregularities over the past couple election cycles. Will come as no surprise to anyone. And everyone knows that former President Trump claimed there was fraud in the election. He lost to President Biden in 2020. But of course, some people I think have already forgotten that he claimed there was also millions of fraudulent votes cast even in the election he won against Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, uh, big question right up front. Were any of those Trump election fraud claims legit?
No, I'd say they weren't. And I'd start with the court outcome because many of those cases wound up being adjudicated. And the one or two instances in which the Trump team won were the same one or two instances where I would say they had a pretty good case, which was some pretty specialized stuff in Pennsylvania about procedures that had been changed or in whatever way. The Republicans generally had a decent claim, which, just to introduce the anticlimactic nature, was over a very small number of votes, not enough to change any outcome. And when it came to all the bigger ones, in all the swing states and elsewhere, the courts often, after a detailed look at the evidence, sometimes, of course, on earlier procedural grounds, um, ruled them out and said, no, you have not, in fact, produced the evidence. And in the years since then, I guess 4 years since then, of course, there's been a much more leisurely chance to look at the evidence that was presented, and also for states, Georgia notably, but also quite a few other states, to do audits and other um, checks that take longer, more than the couple of weeks you have after an election, just to make sure that there was nothing behind some of the claims from the Trump camp of people from other states voting, people who were dead voting, people who were disqualified felons voting, and the various other categories. And those have not panned out in any instance. There was a great study done by a couple of Stanford political science people in which they just sort of went through by brute force like 80 or 100 such claims, concentrated in the 6 swing states, and found no merit to any of them.
All right. Well, putting aside the specific fraud claims of 2020, there are plenty of perennial issues that we do need to worry about when it comes to elections in general. Election security is an important topic, period, regardless of what we think about some of these particular political claims. And I think top among those for a lot of people is the debate over voter ID, whether voters should be required to present some form of ID, whether they should be required to present a state issued photo ID like a driver's license or not, to make sure they are who they say they are. So when it comes to the voter ID question, how aggressive should states be? Because again, this is all a state by state kind of regulated issue. How aggressive should states be with these requirements? And should everyone be expected to show a photo ID?
Well, this is an instance where I think, on the one hand, it's going to turn out to be anticlimactic, as I'll get to in a minute. And on the other hand, I think the conservatives have a pretty good case, actually. And let me start with the anticlimactic part, which is that economists who have looked at this, and there was uh, two studies on this, one I think in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, but um, their conclusion was that the difference between strict and less strict voter ID laws made no difference on uh, apparent levels of fraud, but also made no difference on apparent levels of participation, turnout, and so-called voter suppression. So I think the first lesson is both sides ought to lower the temperature a little bit. Voter ID laws do not, in fact, um, have any measurable impact in current day America. We are not talking about the Chinese literacy tests that were famous in the Jim Crow South. We are talking about America these days. And that's one key to understanding why public support for voter ID laws is as broad as it is and includes minorities, includes language minorities, and it includes the same groups that are allegedly victimized in the sort of enormous liberal narrative that has been built up on this. Now, all that having been said, the fact they also didn't find that it reduced fraud should give pause to some of the conservatives about it. Now, I have a couple of reasons for thinking that, yes, voter ID law enforced typically by looking at picture IDs, although you can construct other ways for people to prove their identity, and that's okay too, since a certain number of legitimate voters don't have those IDs. They have not renewed their driver's license, for example, is the case with many of the oldest voters, and there are other reasons why they might not have them. So, but all that having been said, um, you don't hear a lot of complaints about voter ID laws from election administrators, from the uh, hundreds of thousands of volunteers who actually have to sit at the polls when people come in live. And one reason is that the ID system that is decried as overly strict just makes it faster and easier and means the lines are not as long and means that there aren't as many um, potentials for things to go wrong. Now, I know in Maryland, where I live, I show up and I don't have to show ID. There are various uh, backup security steps which differ from locality to locality. Mail security is also its own issue, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But um, I think that when it comes to mail security, for example, asking people to put the last 4 digits of their driver's license will, in fact, get you 95% plus of the things. It's a good security measure. Signature matching is the big defense on that, but it's not actually all that good. Those who've looked at these things realize that you line up a bunch of humans to see whether and ask them whether signatures match, and you get a lot of disagreement. And then you bring in the machines, which banks and others use to ask the same question, and you find, yeah, maybe they're a little more reliable than the humans, but again, they're not all that great. They may be good enough to um, deter a lot of fraud in that if someone is forging 100 signatures, then a red light may go off in where it's being read, but it's not that great. So these are all moving targets in that fraud can take different forms and can learn ways around barriers. In general, I think that the conservative side starts out with a lot of merit as far as, yes, we need to pay attention, not just to so-called impersonation fraud, but if I could just stop to express frustration about this debate, various media outlets, the New Yorker and elite newspapers are very, very concerned to counter the Stop the Steal story. And of course, up to a certain point, I agree with them. The Stop the Steal story is incorrect, so you might as well refute it. But they go on to say, oh, well, there is no voter fraud problem whatsoever. Why this study of impersonation fraud found that it hardly ever goes on. Well, you need to stop and interrogate that a little bit because next thing you know, there is this scandal from Bridgeport, Connecticut, a few months ago, in which apparently, to all appearances, although she's refusing to testify, a political boss was filling out and signing a bunch of ballots. Now, probably not impersonation fraud because they were from genuine people who were sufficiently in tune with their candidate that they didn't step forward and say, this was voted against the way I wanted to vote. But nonetheless, very illegal, very dangerous. You really don't want that going on at all. And so there is here a genuine election security issue, which is not captured in those numbers about, look how few people have ever been found to commit impersonation fraud by showing up at polls and claiming to be someone when they aren't. So so yes, we need to pay attention to security. That traditional conservative case or traditional Republican case should not be dismissed just because Donald Trump took it in some crazy directions.
Now, one of the things you emphasize in this paper that I think is really interesting is about the need to tabulate results quickly, given that slow reporting has inspired all sorts of conspiracy theories about vote totals being manipulated after the fact, and people in charge of counting them changing the results they don't like, and that in and of itself is not really a security issue at all. It's a sort of popular mass psychology political perception issue, right? Because you could have a completely secure election that counted quickly, and you could have a completely secure election that counted them slowly. But we've seen that there are uh, significant drawbacks in the popular mind to slow vote count. And to take this like example again from the paper in Nevada's experience, you're right that the state that allows people to vote by mail and that all mail voting is usually associated with slower vote counts. And this is something that I've actually thought about a lot over the years, coming from being a native of Oregon, which is one of the pioneers of voting by mail. Um, shouldn't the fact that if you're voting by mail, presumably you get a lot, or a huge supermajority of your ballots significantly before election day, shouldn't those states be the very fastest to count? If they get like three quarters or 90% or whatever it is, numbers in before the election even happens, as opposed to the states that have to count every vote on election day?
You raised some very central questions, and I want to start where you began on the case for fast tabulation in general, because I wrote this paper in part to try to lay out a possible blue, red, left, right area for consensus in which neither side would get all of what they have pressed for in recent years, but they'd get a lot of important things that would bolster the system. And very central to what I think we need a consensus on is faster tabulation. The rest of the world looks at America and they just scratch their heads, because it is typical in European democracies, which are so like us in as far as technology and as far as education levels and so forth, that they know the results on election night. And it doesn't mean that there is no mail voting. There is typically less. But the central thing that you need to do, which runs against the grain for many American states that use this, is you've got to encourage the mail voters not to wait until the last minute. And if they do wait until the last minute, come in and use the machines that are set up for that purpose, which record immediately and do not require, as mail balloting does, a couple of extra steps before they get counted. Now, Oregon is an exception. Oregon, having adopted this first, actually adopted some of the more conservative and restrictive rules. For example, it does not allow, I believe, election day registration, unlike the other mail states. And that in and of itself removes from the system a whole bunch of um, uh, instances that take a while to process because someone didn't show up until election day. And Oregon does a couple of other things too, which I think were born of experience, that even though it doesn't mind being a slow count state, it doesn't want to be as slow as some of these others out there that we have. At any rate, a good symbolic one to look at is, do elections have to reach the authorities by the evening of election day, or can they drift in 4 days, 8 days, 12 days later, so long as the postmark is okay? Now, you have this enormous cultural difference between, and it's mostly liberals, and I take some liberal views in this paper. I'm not trying to come down on liberals as a group, but I just do find it's awfully loosey-goosey to say, wait, counting can wait, counting can wait. You never know how long the post office will take, so let's just allow a very long time, and then longer maybe for so-called ballot cure, which is you forgot to date it or you forgot to sign it, and they'll bring it back to you and say, oh, did you forget to date or sign it? Again, these things may make sense if you tried to vote a week early, and during that week you can come back and fix that thing. On the other hand, if you're still waiting for suspenseful results in this state, do you want to order this extra satisfying customer service 10 or 15 days out from an election? My answer is not if you take promptness of reporting seriously. And if you do take take promise of reporting seriously, then you will join it's something like 2/3 or even more of states that say, sure, but vote by mail, but be sure to get it in by election day. Um, that's not too much to ask. You can look at the ballot and see who's on it way in advance. I mean, there is no suspense typically about who's on the ballot. And if you are one of those people, which is totally legitimate, where you think that a last minute scandal or a last minute revelation might change your vote, well, we can serve you too on election day. It's just not by bringing in a mail ballot; it's by coming in and using a voting machine. The so the states, uh, and Nevada is not one of the absolutely most liberal state, but it's in the more liberal category. And I urge them to um, tighten up on that and a bunch of other things. And let me stop also and say, with respect to the rest of the world, um, musing at how America conducts its elections this way. There was an article in Le Monde. But why do Americans not know who won for days or weeks? And um, there are really practical reasons, aside from fears about fraud, why you want those fast results. You want the transition period um, to be reasonably long in America, where you don't get sworn in until January, so that people know whether they won. If a state happens to have a runoff process, you definitely want the question of who's in the runoff to become apparent within a day. And but even if there isn't, the new person who may be hiring staff and so forth ought to know that they're the new person earlier than mid-December. And likewise for the person who is going to have to depart office after being defeated. All these reasons, constituent service, which person do you call for case management, and on and on and on. Aside from the question of who organizes Congress. Now, Nevada, of course, played a central role here because until it got around to reporting that, I guess it was the re-election of Catherine Cortez Masto, but they took their sweet time about that, and we didn't know whether the Democrats or Republicans would be in control of the U.S. Senate. Lots and lots of things depend on that. So, fraud aside, there's a huge public interest in knowing fast, and there is, I think, a convenience interest for the individual voters that we ought to, at a minimum, be trying to persuade them to yield to the public interest. But also, these rules inevitably, you have to have some rules about this. Certainly, but with voter registration, the idea is that the citizen has some responsibilities. It's not all just set up to make it as easy as possible. There is also an element of civic responsibility you can expect of voters. So that's my little sermon.
That's that's good. Well, I say amen to that sermon. So when it comes to election integrity, a lot of people understandably focus on the procedures that are carried out on election day or immediately running up to it. But I guess the question I have is that, I mean, that gets all the attention, but there's all sorts of longer term stuff that state election officials have to deal with month to month, year to year, in the background. How much should, management of databases and all that sort of thing, when people, move in and out of the state, when they register to vote, how much should we worry about the big day versus like the long-term maintenance of election departments?
Well, the issues about the long-term maintenance of the election departments are naturally a more inside baseball or in the weeds, depending on what metaphor you want, topic. You're never going to get as much public involvement as in the issues about election day because people don't see that unless they take the tour, which I always do advise taking, that your local election official may offer of, tour our premises and see how ballots are processed and all that sort of thing. But for most people, that's always going to be a more remote and abstract kind of thing. But it's super important. And if it is not done properly, and in particular, if you arrive at what I call the crunch season, which is after early voting begins, once the staff demands get really heavy on whoever is working for the elections department, then many more things go wrong. Certainly, if you have inaccurate voter rolls, then a lot of things begin to go wrong. People show up and their address has not been properly updated, or a data entry was made wrong, which happens in this as in all systems. And at that point, they are perhaps absorbing an hour or multiple hours of the scarce staff time that has become scarce because you're now close to the election. And Nevada makes kind of an interesting test tube example because it is America's most transient state, both
Mm.
for move-ins and for move-outs. Nevada, just can look like one big motel as far as how rapidly the role of people who are entitled to vote changes, and so it ups to the highest of the 50 states the challenge that is placed. Now, I talk about a bunch of those technical issues. Some of them, again, will, I think, strike a chord in many other states. For example, the update of voter rolls has traditionally been a local matter, counties often, for example. And this was always kind of interesting in Nevada, which has two urban counties, the ones Clark for Las Vegas and I think Washoe for Reno, and then a bunch of the least populated counties you will find anywhere. And with inevitably technology to match, which is, you walk in and the election official knows you because there are only 850 people in the county. I'm picking that number out of a hat, but your whereabouts and your way of proving who you are completely different than in Las Vegas, and yet they were using the same system. Now, where this kind of system um, tends to reach a practical failure level is on things like cross-county moves by people during the last weeks, which does happen, especially as the counties begin to suburbanize across, or as the cities begin to suburbanize across county lines. You do have people who change from one county to another, at which point you may have one or two of these tiny little rural counties having to field a call about, hey, this person named um, Mary Brown, and common names are the bane of election administrators, because well, I'll get to that perhaps a bit more. But the how do you verify? How do you make sure that the provisional ballot, if that's what the person had to use, gets counted quickly? Well, Nevada has done what many states have had to do, which is to say, despite our long tradition of decentralization, um, given the rate at which people are moving in and out and the possibilities of cross-border moves, we have to have the state take over running a single central database and then feed it to the counties in real time by access. And much as I am a decentralization guy, I wound up looking at the pros and cons and thinking, yeah, I understand it. The state as a whole and all of its voters have an interest in getting that Senate race declared earlier rather than later. Um, I understand and will even cheer their attempts to get a technically sound thing that will, in some ways, help the counties, the rural counties, do their otherwise potentially super challenging job on this. Now, I mentioned the uh, problem of duplicate names, some of the other problems on that. Two other points I would make. One is that Nevada has stayed in a group called ERIC, which some of the listeners will have heard about. And this was an attempt to do a multi-state consortium to share information, particularly useful in moves from state to state. If you're moving from another Western state to Nevada, odds are good the other state is in ERIC, and then more or less right away, you can both find out about the person who moved from that other state to Nevada or vice versa, and both states can begin moving to correct their database. Now, there was this enormous left-right flop, blue-red flop about ERIC, because ERIC was organized with foundation support, and it had some objectives that liberals like better than conservatives in particular. It required, as part of being a state member, that you do some outreach to encourage unregistered people to register, which generally conservatives don't like. And we can remember, but I'm not going to get into the long-standing debate about won't elections come out better if only highly motivated, highly civically aware people vote, and therefore
Mm.
we don't want, super maximum turnout. We should not aspire to 100% turnout because those will be less informed people. So let's not reach out and nag people to register to vote. Um, so there was some, old, long-standing conservative philosophical objections to doing that, and it was part of the ERIC formula in part because it was funded by these liberal foundations. What I argue in the paper is, yeah, there are legitimate arguments about how much ERIC should do, but a state, particularly a state like Nevada, that uses this data a whole lot, and you also get some federal data from it of, I think, Social Security changes and so forth. Um, um, Needs to go with the accuracy and the administrative capability and argue within the organization for it to do to take on only tasks for which there is an ideological consensus, if that's the way you want to do it. The other point I'll bring in, and I know people with CEIs, people with Cato are interested in this, is we generally have opposed for a long time the idea of um, either a national ID card or of effectively moving in that direction by um, making the ID forms that we do have more universal in the way in which they are used. Now, this is an instance in which countries like just France, to go back to France sort of randomly, which long since decided that national ID was the way to do, they can work through certain practical problems a lot faster than a country like ours. I like that fact that we are very grudging of the potential power that these ID forms would give. I think that it means that we have to think more carefully and, perhaps develop institutions which did not develop in Europe to use our more imperfect forms of ID. But I don't think that's not something that is going to defeat the project of election security. By and large, we are achieving pretty great election security without a national ID card, and libertarians should be happy about that.
Well, yeah, and I think the that's an example of just a different system entirely where, in a country like France, you have is known for centralization. The like departments of France do not have the autonomy of U.S. states. They certainly don't have the the structure of administration for something like education, right? It said that, in every day in every classroom, every fifth grade classroom everywhere in France, they're all learning the same thing. That's not we have actually not just state a certain amount of state sovereignty over education policy, but we have, county by county school boards, elected county by county school boards that make significant decisions about schools, which is not reflected in uh, centralized national governments like, say, in France. So I think it would be, I think it's just sort of an interesting thing to point out that you could say, oh, look, France has a national ID, therefore it makes election security easier. That works great for them. Therefore, we should do it. I think you could say all things up to that, and it can be true. It could be good for them. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to transpose into something we should adopt when we have a
Right.
very significantly different political system.
And I, not in this paper, but elsewhere, I get into the fact that the US Constitution is very careful and jealous about reserving to the states and localities control over federal elections. Less so for elections to Congress, very much so for elections to the presidency, in which they put up a lot of barriers against attempts to centralize in Washington management of how those federal elections go. And I consider that brilliant and successful. The founders knew what they were doing on that. And so I generally, and Cato generally says we do not need more federal, more congressional laws for virtually any of the things we've been talking about today. We need to think through the issues and encourage states to use best practices where we can. Consider the technology very carefully because so often, and this will not be news to people at CEI, so often technology can wind up being pro-freedom if it is deployed well, or pro-taxpayer or the various other interests. Technology is not a threat, although particular technologies can be misused.
Well, yeah, and one sort of conceptual theme that I think is interesting that you point out about adopting one potential reform versus another is that some of these kind of can cut both ways in the sense that uh, adopting a reform that solves one problem can exacerbate a different problem, right? So if you wanted to get to, you want to make sure everyone can cast a ballot and that no one's ballots are tossed out, then you would want the most open-ended system possible, and you would wind up with people being able to come back, days and weeks and months later and say, "Oh, sorry, I messed up my ballot. Can I come back and change it?" But of course, that would then create a much bigger problem, which is that the elections would never end. So,
Yeah.
uh, so I think there's some people out there who are saying, "Oh, well, we want to increase this good thing. We want to maximize this value," without always realizing that going to an extreme in one direction can cause a deficiency in another
And
value.
amen. This is something you realize soon after you begin looking at election law is that uh, if you take convenience too far, you begin sacrificing other values. And I like convenience. I mean, and so do voters. But or if you take security as an objection, as trumping everything else, then you begin to impose burdens on voters and administrators that they find unreasonable. And the so you need to be willing to um, recognize the trade-offs, recognize the ways in which you can get enough and a great deal of values like convenience. This is why I think conservatives are fighting a losing battle to some extent when they say, "Oh, let's remember the days when we all used to come together and see our neighbors on election day. Let's go back to those days." That's not, in fact, what most conservative voters even are showing by their actual behavior that they want. We are not living in New England town meeting type villages anymore. Even the New Englanders are not living mostly in town meeting villages. We are in Utah, for example, which was an interesting instance of the spread of many of the things that I recommend from a convenience standpoint, lock boxes, for example. In a definitely conservative state, they found that many of these supposedly liberal innovations were picked up on by groups like stay-at-home moms, as well as retirees, who were in fact more conservative than average in their voting. So Republicans, in fact, were doing great when some of these things were introduced.
All right. And so a lot of, and this is maybe led into some of the controversy which you kind of hinted at, but a lot of regulations of all kinds were changed and relaxed during the COVID-19 pandemic, including some accommodations related to elections. Um, and that has created that created some controversy, some misunderstanding, I think, and then debate over whether uh, sort of pandemic inspired policy changes should continue or not, or whether they were only justified in kind of emergency situations. Is there anything that changed or election procedure proposals that were responsive to COVID-19 that you think were good and should continue?
Well, this uh, was another debate that frustrated me enormously in that people were not fessing up to all of their uh, motivations. There is no doubt whatsoever that a lot of the people who were pressing for the liberal, quote unquote liberal goals in this area, which is more convenience voting, more mail voting, more early voting, used the fact that those were understandable pandemic accommodations. Early in-person voting tended to reduce the prospect of crowds waiting in line, and therefore was certainly better against COVID transmission. But the um, but in fact, you had all these people who had been pressing and suing for those methods completely aside from COVID and before COVID happening, glomming onto them, delighted that they could get them passed because of the, I think, generally legitimate concerns of the pandemic, and then refusing to acknowledge afterward that the same old debate was still legitimate about how much to have. And let me focus in on early in-person voting, because one of the things that you notice when you study the Western states, particularly where vote by mail has made great headway is that, of course, once people get used to voting by mail, not only does election day voting drop, but also people don't use early in-person voting as much. Well, from the liberal camp, and I'm not going to say all of them, but from some of them, uh, there would be these little rosters of states making it harder to vote. And uh, the subtext was these are states that are engaged in voter suppression by making it harder to vote. Well, some of these were states that went from, and I'm picking at the numbers, which may not exactly be this, but went from 3 weeks of early voting during the pandemic to 2 weeks of early voting after the pandemic, when they noticed that it just wasn't going to be used as much. And early in-person voting did collapse in some places after the pandemic. So states naturally, with having to pay people to show up and or call on volunteers who get volunteer burnout, they don't want to use more than makes sense given the rate at which the early voting gets used. And these states got all this, flack shot at them from these organized liberal groups saying, oh, you're suppressing the right to vote. No, they are trying to rationally balance the expenditure of public resources based on who they expect to use the voter system. Please don't. And this, wound up repeating this, so often in different contexts. Please don't take behavior that is fully explained by normal reasons. Please don't make this out to be voter suppression or, contrarily, an attempt to enable voter fraud. Most of people's wishes and policy asks in this area are motivated by, something other than a worst case, we want fraud or we want voter suppression. They just aren't. So please assume good faith more often.
All right, I think that's a solid recommendation. Well, Walter, thank you so much for being with us. And tell the listeners where they can find you and your work on the internet.
Okay, I'm at the Cato Institute. So if you just type in Walter Olson Cato, you will find more of my work than you could possibly want to read. I have 4 books about the legal system, of which the most recent, although it was some time ago, is called Schools for Misrule, about bad ideas from law schools. Tempting to make that book much longer than it was. And then if you want to find this paper, type in my name with terms like Nevada election, and you should find it fast.
All right. Especially, like I said, the study has a lot of great recommendations and analysis on election integrity all across this country, but especially our friends in the Silver State. Look it up. All of our Nevada friends. Take a gamble on this great paper. All right. Thanks again for being with us, Walter.
Thank you.